So the next part of our talk is going to focus specifically on sexual intelligence. So using some of these concepts we just have about the limbic brain and the prefrontal cortex, and talking on how we apply that specifically around sex and developing sexual intelligence. And I'm back at my threefold levels of safety for the chimp. And when we talk about sex, so if we want to have happy sex, whether it's for ourselves or if we want our kids to have happy sex, they need to also have safety on those three levels. And in the UK, when I used to work as a school doctor in the UK with the teenagers, we used to talk about the three yeses. So you need to feel bodily safe. So you need to not have to be worried about pregnancy or STIs. You certainly do not want to be worried that you're going to be hurt in some ways. So bodily, you need to feel safe, and those things need to be in place, such as contraception or whatever it is. From a sexual pleasure point of view, we need to feel emotionally safe to actually experience sexual pleasure. And that means usually being in a caring, loving a relationship where somebody is looking after you and paying attention to you. And then on the level of sexual rights, we need to be able to have freedom of expression for who we are, our identity, our choice of partners, and our control of reproductive health. So I'm very involved in the World Association of Sexual Health as well. We had an amazing conference in Cape Town last year in August, the international conference, the first time on the African continent. And sexual rights was a major issue at that conference. And for example, in places like India, where girls still do not have a choice on when to get married. So girls getting married and having their first child before the age of 18 and not having freedom of expression within their own reproductive health. So there's all these different aspects around safety. So sex is all about the chimp, right? All about the chimp. But the only one that can actually build safety and create the safety we need for the chimp to be happy and have great sex is the sage, is that prefrontal cortex part of ourselves. And so one of the ways of thinking about it is, if you think about sex, if you think about intimacy itself, so the actual act where I am getting intimate with a partner, that's all chimp. It's all endocrinology, right? It's all run through our hormones. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But to be able to create a safe space for those times when we are intimate with someone, we need to actually have some stage activity before intimacy. So we need to be able to have, before we're going to have sex, to actually have a discussion about sex. So when I was a school doctor in England, I was also the GP at the local NHS practice. And two of the kids that was at school, they were in grade 11. They were 17 years old. They'd been going out for more than a year. A boy and a girl came in to see me because they decided they're going to have sex and they wanted to talk to me about contraception. Matter of fact, in all my years as a doctor, it's the only time I've ever seen a couple coming to see me before they were going to have sex. And it's one of the very few consultations where a male partner came with to talk about contraception. And that's an amazing ability to see that these young people had discussed their sexual relationship before they got to that point. But also for those of us who are in sexual relationships, we actually need to have moments and times in our relationship where we reflect on sex and what's been happening and how that was. Reflection during sex is never such a good idea. It sort of doesn't quite work. But we need to be able to sort of almost carry that chimp within this boundaries of safety. So when I talk about sexual intelligence, it's very much based similar on the model of emotional intelligence, where we have to be able to reflect on our own sexual selves. We have to understand who we are as sexual beings and therefore be able to manage who those sexual self is. This is what I want. This is what I don't want. This is what I like. This is what I don't like. And similarly, we have to be able to understand who my partner's sexual self is, and therefore being able to manage the relationship and being able to understand what those sexual needs mean. And this kind of intelligence is sadly lacking in a lot of relationships and is sadly lacking in a lot of communications. So to be able to reflect on your sexual self, I want to introduce you to a great tool that was created. It's an international cool tool. It was based on something called the Genderbread Man, but WITS RHI has actually taken it to a South African context. We use a lot in our sexual health clinics, and I have added some aspects to it. So this is my extended version of what we call Gender Taboo. Now, Gender Taboo is a tool that we often use in our sexual health clinics when we talk to adolescents, but I use it with my adults as well, to also talk about how to help them understand their own sexual self, and how to use that to communicate to a partner. So I want you to imagine you're in a scenario with teenagers where they've gone through this exercise. They're in a relationship with somebody, and before they get to the point where they have sex, they sort of talk through their gender taboos with each other. And this is an extraordinary prefrontal cortex exercise where we're bringing a balcony view to understanding who we are and what our sexuality is like. So we're going to run through a gender taboo, because I'm not going to assume that we are all highly sexually intelligent adults. And there might be some of these questions you have not actually thought of. It might not be that it's relevant in a relationship, or if you might not even be in a relationship. But if you're not comfortable with these concepts in this language, you can't talk to your teenagers about these concepts and use this language. So it's a little bit to introduce you into some also of the concepts that are out there. So we're going to start off with biological sex. When I send around my presentations in the notes sections of my YouTube channel, we'll have a link to the gender taboo tool. And the first thing we look at is the sex we are assigned at birth. So we call that biological sex. So this is what the midwife says when you are born. Oh, it's a boy, or oh, it's a girl, or oh, I'm not so sure. And when we talk about biological sex, there's usually specific characteristics. So this is the genitalia. Is it penises or vaginas, or vulvas? Is it chromosomes XX, XY? Are we talking ovaries or testicles? Do they have a womb? Do they not have a womb? Do they have testosterone or estrogen? How are they responding to those hormones? And do they have beards or do they have breasts? So these are all just some of the aspects of biological sex, typically. What's interesting is that about 1 in 1,000 babies, when they are born, you can't clearly classify as either boy or girl. And we call that intersex. And there's lots of different diversity even within that term. And in South Africa, it's about 1 out of 1,000 births children have intersex, and it's as common, therefore, as twins. There's a lot of advocacy now around intersex. So many years ago, luckily no longer, doctors and parents would decide at birth, oh, I think my child should rather be a boy or a girl. They would try and figure it out from the chromosomes or whatever, do surgery when they were little, give them hormones as they grew up. And this has become problematic. And now we are much more advocating that the child themselves choose what gender or sex they want to be once they grow up. And a lot of intersex people are quite comfortable with whatever configuration they have, and they pick whatever gender they feel comfortable with and do not necessarily need intervention. The second concept is that of gender identity. So this is one of those very hot topic concepts for those of you who are on social media. If it's one of those things that's been confusing you or you're not sure, I'm hoping I can just clarify some of the terminology. And certainly we need to know the terminology that is being used and is very much under the discussion of our young people. So the Yogyakarta principles that South Africa has also signed up to in terms of human rights law define it as each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth. So if you look at my lovely little block at the bottom here, when we ask people to look at their gender identity, I can even ask you yourself, so how female do you feel? Are you very female, feminine, or are you not female or feminine at all? Are you very male, man, masculine, or you're not very male, man, masculine at all in the way you identify? Or actually, do you consider yourself an other or different gender? And you can see, depending on where you put your little mark, there's lots of variety and there's lots of possibilities. You get some people who feel completely female and some people who feel completely male. And you get some people who feel a bit of a mix of both. And you get some people who don't feel very much like either. And sometimes it aligns with what they were assigned at birth, and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to spend a few slides on the terminology on this. I'm very aware that culturally and religion, some people find this concept how should I put it, unclear or not sure about where to fit it in with their own cultural understanding and beliefs. Think of it more just being educated about what's out there and being able to understand what it is and what we know about it, because there's quite a lot of different things we've discovered about this. The most important thing to understand about what we call transgenders, so those are people who have a different gender identity than they were the one assigned at birth is that it's biologically determined. So that's now been very clear. We have lots of studies looking within the worldwide population, and it's pretty much a standard number of people worldwide will be considered to fall under the transgender umbrella. And when we look at development, there's an amazing book by Prof. Dick Schwab. He's a neuroscientist. We now know that gonadal sex is set in the first trimester of pregnancy, so that's your male or female genitalia. But gender identity, so how you consider yourself, is already laid down in the second trimester of pregnancy. And it's got quite a large genetic component, up to as much as 50% in some studies. And then there's also a lot of other hormonal and developmental things that play in. This we're still exploring, but what's very clear is that it's pretty much fixed by the time you're born. So because of this evidence and because of this understanding, at the World Health Assembly in 2019, that's very recent, 3 years ago, the WHO ruled definitively that being a trans or a gender diverse person does not mean to suffer a mental disorder. And we now consider different forms of sexual orientation and gender as just part of the normal variations of human experiences. So as a result of this, in medicine, we have gone through a process through the World Association of Sexual Health, the WHO, and also within South Africa, of what we call the depathologizing of transgender. And we went through a similar process with homosexuality 20 years ago. So, for example, you all know the ICD-10. That's a thing you have to write on the code you need on your medical aid. It used to be called gender identity disorder in the ICD-10, but the ICD-11 now, they've changed it in 2018 to be called gender incongruence, which just means an experience of your gender being different than the gender you were born. And they still need that as a code for people who then take hormone therapy to help them feel more aligned with their gender identity. There's a psychiatric classification book called the DSM, and the DSM-4, they also called it gender identification disorder. And in 2013, that was changed to gender dysphoria, which means the discomfort you feel with being a different gender than the one you were assigned at birth. And in 2021, the World Association of Sexual Health brought out a sexual rights statement, specifically including gender identities and bodily diversity. So that's our intersex for human rights protection. And the South Africa Constitution, it's also now been tried and confirmed that when we speak about gender as our constitutional protection, it includes gender identity, also carries legal rights and protection. So that's just the terminology, just way too new. We talk cisgender when your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth are at line. So you're going, yep, this is what was a boy when you were born and you consider yourself a boy. Transgender people is where the gender identity is different than the gender assigned, the sex assigned at birth. And then gender diverse is a general term for people who do not conform to society or culture's expectations of men and women. And I thought I'll just cover the 3 major groups that we see with gender identity because it is so new. Not that transgender is new. I'll just give an example. I think in the 1940s, 1950s, it was not thought to be correct to be left-handed. So they used to tie kids' hands behind their backs and make them only write with the right hand. And they thought about 1% of the population was left-handed. And then once it was clear that actually, no, it's completely fine, it's not a problem at all, and you can be left or right-handed, they discovered that actually 10% of the population is left-handed. And we've seen the same thing happening with gender diverse people. So gender diversity has always been around since old, and it's becoming more acceptable because we understand it's got a biological basis. You will see a lot more younger people thinking about gender identity and using these terminologies. So transgender women, trans femme, that's the Laverna Cox up there, is somebody who was assigned male at birth, but now identifies as a woman and would use the pronoun she, her. And one of our well-known South Africans is Lehlogonola Machaba, who was our first trans woman to make the Miss SA top 30. A transgender man or transmasculine or trans man is somebody who was assigned female at birth, but they identify as a man and they use the pronouns he or him. So Elliot Page there in the top, very well known. He played actually a pregnant girl in the movie Juno, and he's recently transitioned. And then in South Africa, Noxie Milane is a very well-known YouTuber in KZN, a rural boy who's been taking his rural transitioning and showing that on YouTube and talking about his experiences. And then we have a concept that is very new in terms of a term, although it's been around for a long time: non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer, agender. To different people, all those words will mean different things. But that can be anybody from any biological sex who do not feel that their gender identity falls into these traditional binary categories of male or female. And that's where we have this new pronoun. Well, it's not a new pronoun, it's an old pronoun. It's very popular with Shakespeare, the singular they, them. So, for example, when you talk about a child and you will say, don't give the child sweets, it's bad for their teeth. So you would use a singular pronoun when you refer to a child, for example. And Zanele Moholi here is an amazing photographer, had an extraordinary exhibition at the Tate in London, doing photography and particularly photographing experiences and issues around gender diverse communities in South Africa. So this is just to understand some of the language out there. So once one looked at gender identity, there's also gender expression, which is actually a completely different concept. So for you yourself as well, if you look at the way, this is very culturally defined, what you consider masculine or feminine, but you can ask yourself, how feminine am I in my expression? How masculine am I in the expression? Do I express myself in some other way that I don't consider either masculine or feminine? And you can get lots of mixes. So this is Jonathan Van Ness, they're non-binary, and this was at the Emmys for their program Queer Eye, where you can see they have got a mixed gender expression. So they've got the lovely, gorgeous boots and the masculine beard. And this can be independent from your gender identity. So you can have somebody who can be a cisgendered man, even heterosexual, but likes dressing very feminine, when he goes out. So great. We've looked at the first three parts of our gender taboo. The last one, I'm going to go very quickly, and then we're actually going to talk about sex itself, and that's just sexual orientation. So being able to, this we're quite familiar with, and just to highlight, remember, sexual orientation is different than gender expression. So this is who you are attracted to. And this is an interesting conversation to have with young people. When the world I grew up, this assumption, if you're a girl, you're obviously attracted to boys. If you're a boy, you're obviously attracted to girls. And there wasn't a concept of really trying to think, well, who am I attracted to and how am I attracted to people? Attractions. And it's also interesting to see on how recently homosexuality was still considered a diagnosis. So in 1973, it was still a psychiatric diagnosis and was only removed out of the ICD in 1992. That's a mere 30 years ago. And in South Africa, in the South Africa in the apartheid years, homosexuality was a crime punishable by up to 7 years in prison. And then we had this amazing turnaround that the South African Constitution was one of the first in the world to prohibit unfair discrimination, specifically on the grounds of sexual orientation. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is not always like that. And there are still countries in the world where there are death sentences for LGBT behavior, and quite often through stoning. So when we look at the larger, broader sexual rights within the world, that same freedom is not everywhere. What's interesting, though, is that although we've had democracy, sexual orientation is within our rights, that does not necessarily reflect how we feel about it as a population. So this is an amazing study done by the Human Sciences Research Council in 2016 about what is the attitudes towards homosexuality and gender non-conforming peoples by South Africans. And I just want to highlight one thing. It's called Progressive Prudes. It's a lovely thing to read. I think it's probably moved on quite a bit in the last 6 years already. But I want to highlight this extraordinary it's not even a contradiction. It's a wonderful quality we have as South Africans. And in this study at that stage, 51% of the South Africans believed that the gay people should have exactly the same rights as themselves under the Constitution. But 72% of that same group that was surveyed did believe that same-sex sexual activity is morally wrong. So what we have here is we have specific ideas in terms of what my culture believes or what my religion believes, but being able to still respect the rights of others. And I think that's one of the wonderful and extraordinary qualities of South Africans, this ability that we have our own ways of doing things, we have our own cultural ways and what we believe in, but we can still build a community where we can respect and look after the rights of others. So let's get a little bit more into the actual sexual side of things. And one of the things that we do not always, now one of the big problems in the world of sex today is that it's all about sex. So when we look at relationships and we look at physical attraction, so this is the desire that you have to be close to somebody and to be physically intimate with somebody. If you look in the world today, if you look at the media, if you even look at the medical textbooks, it's all about sex. But actually, there are different ways in which people like being intimate. That is not necessarily only based on sexual pleasure, and there's a mixture of the two. So I'm going to separate them here and show you what both look like. And the one we're going to call sexual pleasure, and the other one I'm calling sensual pleasure. If you go on the internet, you get quite a lot of things we call eroticism, which is all about sex. And then you get a term called nurturance, which is all about this sensual pleasure. But both of them have to do with physical attraction. So I'm not just talking about emotional attraction here. I'm actually talking about getting physically intimate with somebody else. And I think the important thing to realize is that sexual pleasure is not the automatic default. And what do I mean with that? To help explain it, we're going to go a little bit back, and there in the corner there, you see Masters and Johnson, which caused a lot of the confusion. What they did at the time was amazing. So this was the 1960s. And in the right there, you see what's called the Masters-Johnson-Kaplan model of sexual response. I was taught this at medical school, as probably still. They was the first ones to really start studying sex. So how does sex work? And what they did was they had a lab in Virginia, and couples came in and had sex in their lab with various electrodes on them. And they studied sex scientifically through these couples. What made it interesting is who they chose. There was criteria to be able to be part of the study. So you had to be heterosexual, they had to be married, you had to be cisgendered, and the woman had to be able to have an orgasm during vaginal sex. So for those of you that's not very au fait with all of these kinds of things, that's actually very uncommon. I think less than 5% of women are able to do that. So this was a very specific population they were studying. And yet this became the model of how we measure sex. This is what sex is. This is how people enjoy physical, and this is what it's all about. And it's caused a lot of confusion. So let's just talk about the two different ones. I'm going to talk about sexual pleasure, this we know, but just to contrast it with what I'm talking about when I say sensual pleasure. When I talk about sexual pleasure, it always starts with what we're going to call sexual desire or arousal. We also call it lust or sexual urge. And sexual desire is always very linear. It's always focused on orgasm. It's all about the genitals. That's where it wants to go. So once you have sexual desire, your whole body is geared towards orgasm, and it follows that little cycle of Masters and Johnson. If you look physiologically at the body, what's happening during sexual desire and during sexual arousal, heart rate goes up, the skin flushes, you get increased muscle tension, you get increased sensitivity of the erogenous zones, and it's almost like a physiological contraction that takes place. In of there might be increased vaginal wetness, although that can also be discordant, but we won't cover that here. But there's some very clear genital-based changes that takes place. And important, whether it's male or female, is that testosterone is always involved. So if you don't have testosterone, you can't experience sexual desire. So the eunuchs, for example, where they used to castrate men to work in the palaces, that would take away their testosterone production, which is produced in the testis in men, for example, and those men will not be able to experience sexual desire. What's interesting, though, is that if you measured somebody's testosterone levels, you won't be able to tell how much sexual desire they have. And simply giving testosterone does not necessarily increase sexual desire. It does a little bit, but it's very variable depending on your body. So it depends also on the testosterone receptors that you have on how you respond to testosterone. So it's not a simple linear relationship. Great. So this is sex we know. This is Grey's Anatomy sex, right? Burst through the on-call rooms, etc., etc. Different kind of physical intimacy we're going to call sensual pleasure. And this framework, they often call it nurturance. When you talk about it, I'm thinking of it wider than just emotional attraction. And this is much more circular in form, and it starts with sensual attraction. So when we talked about sexual attraction, if you want to think in terms of teenagers, your teenage boy, 95% of your teenage boys fall beautifully into that category, right? They feel sexual desire when they see somebody from the same or opposite sex they're attracted to. And when they dream about sex, it's all about orgasm. But when you talk about sensual, when you talk about, for example, our teenage girls, it looks like quite a large percentage of them, and we don't have enough data on this, has predominantly sensual attraction. So when they see that gorgeous guy or girl that they are attracted to, they have a different experience. So this experience is not sexual desire. It's the starry-eyed, the weak knees, the giddy, the swoon. We were watching the Elvis movie the other night, and you have all those girls screaming in the front of the stage. And that actual hysteria is partly also lots of adrenaline, but actually it's predominantly this sensual attraction that is being experienced. And it's very intense. It's not a little feeling. It's expansive. It's euphoric. It's very relaxing. It's in the moment. It's not goal orientated. It's not working towards orgasm. It's got a tingling of the skin over the entire body, and it's not necessarily focused on it's not focused on the genitals at all. What's interesting is because it's mediated by oxytocin, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's also linked to feelings of intimacy and warmth and love. So it's quite often accompanied by a massive crush on whoever you are liking. It is linked to the ability to be vulnerable, to respect communication and affection. So it's a little bit different than testosterone. And the physical pleasure is from sensual touching, but it's not about genitals. So holding hands, kissing, the touching of the hair. And so that bottom moment, we all know that lovely moment in the Titanic, where Rose stands and got her arms out. And at that moment in time, there's a good chance that what she's experiencing is a vast amount of sensual attraction, where Jack might be experiencing something else. So as I've mentioned, this is mediated by a different hormone completely called oxytocin. And when there's sensual pleasure, oxytocin is always involved. But again, if you measure oxytocin levels, it's not predictive. So women tend to have more oxytocin. And so we would see quite often in women this more sensual attraction, where men tend to have more testosterone, but there's definitely crossovers. Men also most definitely can experience sensual desire, and women most definitely also experience sexual desire, but the way they mix up can be slightly different. Interestingly enough, in men, when they mostly experience oxytocin, it's just post-orgasm. So with orgasm, a lot of oxytocin is actually released. And that expansive, happy, sleepy feeling is directly due to that oxytocin. And we're going to come back again to that in a minute when we put it all together. But lastly, I just want to talk about sexual libido. So libido, when we talk about libido, the challenge with libido is that libido only refers to sexual desire. So that's how the term was invented, right? So when Masters and Kaplan looked at this sex cycle, they were like, you start with sexual desire, it goes up towards orgasm, then resolves, that's how sex works. And so everybody is obsessed in terms of attraction about how much sexual desire they have and what's the right amount of sexual desire, something called female sexual interest disorder. And in both of those scenarios, they're trying to figure out how horny are you supposed to be? And the reality is, and we now know very clearly that it's different in different people on whether they actually experience sexual desire. So an amazing woman, Rosemary Basson, and if you're really interested in this kind of concepts, Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, an excellent sex education book around spontaneous versus responsive sexual desire. So it was women who finally broke out of this old mold and said, well, hold on, maybe female sex for a lot of women is not quite the way it's described in the Masters and Kaplan study, and started looking at how women actually experience sexual desire. So there's two types that she describes. The one is the typical one, and this is now back to our teenage boys. So let's stick with our teenage boys, teenage girls. So teenage spontaneous sexual desire is your typical thing that we associate with our teenage boys. So it's actually very visual testosterone. It's triggered by simple stimuli. So it's almost like there's a little bit of desire always under the surface, and it takes very little for it to come to the fore, particularly a problem for our teenage boys. There'll be spontaneous sexual thoughts, spontaneous sexual fantasies, even not necessarily triggered by the environment. And this is often linked, not inked, apologies, to regular masturbation. And that's what we expect from our boys. And usually by about 11, 12, this starts kicking in due to the increase of testosterone in their bodies. But you also get something called responsive sexual desire. And what's important to understand is that responsive sexual desire is normal. So in people who do not have very high testosterone levels, but are predominantly oxytocin, like a large percentage of our teenage girls are, they do not necessarily experience spontaneous sexual desire. So if they're in a specific context, they can experience sexual desire, but it's usually in a scenario where they are safe, where they are in a scenario where they've already had a lot of that. We talked about that sensual pleasure, and then it might go into sexual desire. But they never experience, or very rarely, spontaneous sexual thoughts. It doesn't come up. They do not have spontaneous sexual fantasies, and they might never masturbate. One of the challenges we are is that women get told, oh, well, if you don't ever masturbate, then there's something wrong and you're suppressed, and maybe you haven't got, you're not in contact with your lower self, and all of these ideas that's been built up. And now we know, well, actually, no, some women are just born like that. And we actually think it's quite a large percentage of women. So there's been studies where they would say 70% of women have low sexual libido. And we're going, well, actually, it's the majority of women, so maybe it's not pathological. That's actually normal. And it's also normal for the 20 or 30% of women who do experience spontaneous sexual desire. So what's the challenge is that these concepts are not taught at school. Everybody's supposed to be experiencing all these spontaneous sexual fantasies. When your boy visualizes a relationship with a girl, quite often it's going to be all about the sex, the orgasm side of it. But if you're a responsive sexual desire, a lot of these girls, when they imagine the first time they're going to have sex, it's a bit like the movies. They imagine like the kiss and the hand holding and maybe even what they're wearing and the undressing and all of that. But when it gets to the sex bit, it's a bit like the movies, where the camera just drops out of sight. And they don't necessarily have sexual feelings, so they don't actually visualize or fantasize about sex. So let's put this together, shall we? So now just on those two axes, and there's more axes than just these, you can have some people who are predominantly all about the orgasm. That's the way their bodies work, right? And you can some people who's all about the cuddling and the snogging and the kissing, right? Just the way their bodies work. And then there are people who have a lot of spontaneous desire. So they often think about sex, and sexual fantasies often come up, just the way their bodies work again. And then you get people who've got more responsive desire. So they do get sexual desire. They can actually have quite a lot of sexual desire, but it only comes in response to a context once they're feeling safe and happy and ready to actually have sex. So let's take this to a nice example, because I've seen scenarios like this, especially in my work in England, not so much in South Africa, because the teenagers don't come in and tell me about these things. So I want you to imagine it's the matric dance. Let's make both our kids 18 to keep it simple. And they've watched enough American movies to believe that at the end of the prom, you're supposed to lose your virginity, and they've decided they're going to have sex. They've gone out for a good year now. He's got the condoms. It's all ready. But they've had the normal sex education and are not aware of some of the concepts we've just been teaching. So let's assume our boy falls in this left-hand top corner, got a high level of spontaneous desire, and he experiences pleasure mostly through eroticism, meaning all about the orgasm. So since he's been 11, 12 years old, when he's fantasized about sex, that's what it's all about. So now let's imagine our girl. She's in our bottom corner here, and she is physiologically going to have desire mostly through responsive desire, and she experiences pleasure mostly through oxytocin, right? So she's been madly in love with this boy, weak-eyed, Timmy, starry-eyed and weak-kneed, and they're on the couch or they're in their bedroom and everything's going well. And they are both very attracted to each other, and they are both physically enjoying what is happening. But now remember, the boy is assuming that what he's noticing in the girl is also sexual desire. She's not even sure what sexual desire is because she's never experienced the boy, because it's all about sexual desire. It's all about the genitals. So for the guy, it will be all about the dick. And so he's assuming the girl is the same. And so you have the classic, the scene in the movies where the hand starts creeping up the skirt kind of a thing. And what the girl experiences is that because she's not yet experiencing sexual desire, it's not yet flipped into that level, she has an experience of being uncomfortable. So the genitals are not yet awake, blood flow is not yet there, it's everywhere else, and suddenly that feels invasive and it doesn't feel right. There's a couple of things that can happen here. The one thing is that she follows her instincts. She closes her legs, she pushes the hand away, and she goes, no, I don't think I'm ready. And now you have a very confusing conversation because he doesn't get it. She looked very ready and she thought she was ready, and all of that dramas. The other scenario, which unfortunately I think happens more often, is she's now decided she's going to have sex. This was the plan, and all is going according to plan. And she just pushes through. She's not able to communicate what she's experiencing, and she's not able to communicate that she doesn't necessarily like what is happening. I'm going to into desire, but sometimes, more often than is comfortable, they end up having a sexual experience which the girl does not enjoy. It might just be an experience which ends up being disappointing, or it might even be an experience where the girl has a feeling that she's been somehow assaulted, or that's been invasive. This kind of misunderstanding becomes very difficult because they don't know how to communicate about what's happened. And I've had lots of girls that tell me that they just don't like sex, or they don't get sex, or that sex was so horrible, or the guy doesn't really understand them. And a lot of this is to do with this disconnect and being able to communicate what they like. So if you look at sort of in our society, if you've a boy that's in your boys with a high spontaneous desire, which we see in 95% of our teenage boys, we start having these labels, right? Men only want one thing, and we're sort of dismissive about their very normal levels of spontaneous desire. If you've got high spontaneous desire in a girl who's therefore comfortable to have sex without all the emotional oxytocin and stuff going on, you get a lot of slut shaming and judging of girls who have the same sexual experiences as boys. And if you've got girls with low spontaneous desire, then they can get called cock teasers, or they get called frigid, and there's all these classifications that happens, and in that we are not recognizing the diversity of sexuality. To make it even more complicated is our sexuality changes. So your sexual pleasure is going to be affected by your type of sexual desire, your experience of bodily pleasure, but it also changes your age. So men in their 40s, 50s are not the same as men when they were in their teenage years. It depends on the life phase you go through. If you've got small children, it's going to change your circumstances. It depends on the kind of relationship you're in. It depends on your sexual orientation, your gender identity, who do you are when you're having sex. It's going to get affected by medical and mental health conditions throughout your life, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get into a sexual relationship with somebody, there's no ways that you're going to know what their gender taboo looks like, or what their sexual self is like. And not being able to communicate to somebody else, this is where I am at the moment in terms of my sexual self, and being able to listen and understand where somebody else is in terms of their sexual self, is an extraordinary sage activity that I think is essential for happy and healthy sex. So to be able to have healthy sex, you have to understand and accept your own sexuality. You have to understand and accept your partner's sexuality, and communication here is absolutely key. And part of that, and this is one of the big strong things we teach when we look at gender taboo, is consent. Sex is never a compromise. It's not about saying, Okay, great. Well, I don't like this so much and you don't like it. If you do this for me, then I'll do that for you. That's not the way it works. There's more than enough spaces in sex where we can find things that we all enjoy. You need to be able to find out what those common ground is. And nobody should ever feel that they should compromise any part of themselves in terms of a sexual relationship. So to round off, I've got a few age-specific suggestions to make it really practical. Looking at these concepts, start talking to my child about sex. And I think up until about the age of 8 to 9, we don't really tend to use sex concepts. We don't really teach them these things because their prefrontal cortex is not available for conversation yet. What we do want to do during these years is develop our children grit, their will, their body positivity, their self-confidence. And this is the kind of things that schools are hopefully focusing on. But very important, by the time the child turns 10, between the age of 9 to 10, that conversation about sex has to happen. And even if the child is not asking, some 19-year-olds can seem very young. That as the prefrontal cortex mature, the children start to hear things, they start to pick up things, they start to click things. And it becomes very important that you as a parent is the one that actually talks about what sex is and what the terms mean. So when I was a school doctor, we used to run workshops in grade 3 with the parents to start building capacity on how do we talk to our kids about sex. And as teachers, we need to be aware of which parents might not be comfortable to talk to their kids about sex so that conversation can happen. If the conversation at 10 doesn't happen, the child's going to hear it from someone else. They're going to pick it up, whether it's through media or a friend, and it's usually not. But even at that age, we can use gender taboo. I don't use it much for the child to self-reflect so much, but all the concepts need to be familiar. So the child needs to know about gender identity, about sexual orientation, about different kinds of attraction. Remember, by 11, 12, a lot of your boys will start having their first seminal emissions, medical. We also call it sperm arc, and will start masturbating for the first time. Your girls will start to wonder about sexual attraction and what sex is versus what they're experiencing. So talking about these concepts is very important. And then once a child is 14, 15, in those later teenage years, it's very important that we ourselves start helping that stage development. A very important part of that is for us to show how we manage our dragons and our chimps. That's the hard bit. But also being able to give our kids access to good information. And general Google search is not the best place. So being able to be aware of what's available at school. There's an amazing concept called GSA clubs, which is Gender and Sexuality Alliance clubs, for kids to talk about gender and sex in safe environments with some supervision and be able to give good information about these questions. And at home, we want to be able to have open balcony view discussions. So not fear-based discussions of how horrible and all the things that go wrong, but real discussions around sexual diversity, around consent, apologies for the spelling there, and around how we think about sex. Gender taboo is a great way to do that. And one of my favorite ways to do sage discussions with my kids is to use movies. So we've got movie nights on Friday nights and Saturday nights, and we'll and every single movie or soap opera out there has got lovely examples of chimp behavior, of sage behavior, and of some of these concepts, and being able to ask your kids and having discussions, well, what do you think about that? Have you thought about that? What do you think? How could that be a way to help build that reflection? And then very, very important is affirmation for who our children are. This is tricky. So if your social construct or your religion or your culture has got very specific ideas, I think the one on the topic on the table at the moment is gender diversity, right? So if you've starting to discuss, if you've got a kid that comes out as gender diverse, what do we do in those scenarios? And I think that's where it's so important to bring a balcony view, to be able to look at the wider perspective, to be able to have those wider discussions. The one thing I do want to say here, and that I think parents need to be aware of, is that when we don't affirm our children, and with affirmation, it means affirming whatever gender identity or sexual orientation or abilities they have. I'm able to say, I love and accept you for who you are. When we're not able to do that, it has consequences. So we've had tragic scenarios of families where in the culture, the trans child was not accepted. It was simply said, it's a phase, it doesn't fit in with our lifestyle, it doesn't fit in with our beliefs, and the child not affirmed. And what we see is much higher levels of anxiety, depression, but most worrying is very high levels of suicide in comparison with other teenagers. And some of the tragic conversations that I've had with families, the regret of not having understood at the time the implications of not affirming. So I'm not saying automatically in your family this is an easy discussion in terms of what you do, but being aware of the consequences of saying, of not being able to affirm your child, and probably finding professional help or finding other people to help you cope with a situation like that in your home. The one thing that is very clear is that if a child, quite often children go through phases where they are trying to figure out their identities. It's a wonderful prefrontal cortex activity. Who am I? What am I? Who am I attracted to? It can change, it can come. And if we give space for them to really explore that and think that through and figure that out, it also helps them to really find out in the end who they truly feel they are. But once they're very clear about their gender identity, it's not possible to change it. And that's important to understand. So, for example, in 2009, the American Psychology Association actually had to inform psychologists that they weren't allowed to even consider offering conversion psychotherapy to try and convert either gay people or trans people, because it didn't work. It was not shown to be effective in any way and form. But more importantly, there was a much higher level of suicide. So it is not possible to change our children, and therefore to look at, well, how do we affirm and how do we work with those scenarios? And I understand that that's not easy depending on cultural and religious backgrounds. But if we bring our sages to the parties, it's quite amazing how people can find perspectives and context on how to best deal with that in their families. So I'm at my last slide as a last few just nuggets to go forward. In my other presentations, I talk a lot about dual awareness, which just means our ability to be aware of our own inner chimp and becoming more and more aware when we look at the world out there and when we look at ourselves. Am I on chimp level now, or am I on sage level? And when you're dealing with your teenagers in really difficult scenarios, you know, when things have really hit the fan, when you're now dealing with those heart crunching things that sometimes happens in our lives, being able to be aware, how do I access my inner sage to deal with that? And my presentations deal on some of the neuroscience with that. I would like to challenge you to reflect on your own sexuality using the gender taboo and having a conversation with your partner or your future partners if you are dating. It's fun. It's fun, and it actually takes a relationship to a whole new level. And then in terms of your parenting, safe chimps, keep those little chimps safe, and help our children to get in lots of Jedi practice by reflecting on the world, their identities, and the places around them. So that's actually bringing all of this. There's so much one can cover, but I think that gives enough, I'm hoping, to give you some ideas of just challenging to think about how do I grow the emotional intelligence and sexual intelligence in my children, and to really encourage you to go out there and look at some of the things that are out there into helping us develop these skills. Thank you very much. The recording will finish here and I will make those available on YouTube, but I would like to now open the floor for questions and discussion. As I've said, the questions and discussion